Hi and welcome to this episode of the Ninja and the Gora. Today we're speaking to Ben Crystal, who is one of the planet's foremost experts on possibly the world's greatest writer, who is William Shakespeare. Ben's also an author. He's written Shakespeare on Toast, Shakespeare Words and the Shakespeare Miscellany. He's also an actor and creative producer who more than dabbles into anything Shakespeare, but is probably best known for his original language delivery.
Yeah. So welcome, Ben. I will
Thanks for having me.
Start with our first question is, when did the acting bug actually bite you, or the Shakespeare bug bite you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to see you both. Nice to be with you. Let's see. The acting bug bit when I was 11. I wanted to spend more time with my best friend at the time, and he'd just been cast in an amateur production of Bugsy Malone. And I started doing high school musicals partly I was lonely. I was being bullied, and I found a home in the theatre, I suppose. And but I didn't have a very strong singing voice. So I ended up being given all of the character parts, let's say, and I remember I was in Oliver, and I had to play like the old man, and I had a beard and a cane, and then I had to run off stage and throw off the wig and the cane and walk on as a chirpy young man and all that kind of thing. And there was a woman in the audience who was setting up an amateur dramatic society here in Holyhead in North Wales. And she said, "Would you come and audition?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "We're going to be opening with The Tempest by William Shakespeare." And I said, "Nope," because I hated Shakespeare in school. I never understood it. It didn't make sense to me on the page at all. And I had a great time with the cast, you know, the normal creative camaraderie. But the growing realization that I was supposed to play a spirit of the air that could fly. And we were rehearsing a comedy that was very funny to us in the first few days. And then over the weeks and months that you normally get rehearsing 2 nights a week with an amateur dramatics company, it was steadily getting less funny and less funny and less funny. And I think the bug hit on the night of the first performance.
Right.
I leapt out on stage, still not knowing how to fly. And then the next thing I knew, the show was over and everyone was thrilled, and someone said, "My goodness, you flew around the stage. It was amazing." And it was exhilarating and wonderful. And I realized I never wanted to do anything else. And I suddenly got Shakespeare. It was as if the circle had been squared, because what had been missing all of the time I'd been studying it in a book was not learning it by head to form a response for an exam, but learning it by heart as if the words were mine. And then the other half of that wonderful apple was the engagement with the audience, the connection that sends the electricity all around. And I think once I realized that how Shakespeare lives with an audience, I never wanted to do anything else.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It kind of brings me to the next question. As an actor, obviously, you've got the same character. You could do a play, a dozen different productions, a dozen different actors, and each actor will bring themselves into the role. Or so how do you shape a character differently than another actor? How do you bring something new to a part?
Absolutely. I'm going to use Shakespeare as my model, if I may.
Of course, absolutely.
I describe the verse that Shakespeare spends a lot of his time writing in, which has a particular structure to it of rhythm and a bunch of other things. And some people feel that structure can be restrictive, but actually it provides the foundation on which you can leap from. It provides just enough structure and gives just enough guidance to allow so much room for you. So you can both learn the parts of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, whichever way around you like in this modern world. And it will be completely different from the performance I might give if I learned those parts. because it's like Shakespeare provides the most beautiful, ornate frame. But the canvas is blank, and then you paint that canvas with a combination of his words and the paints that, you dip the paintbrush in your heart, I suppose, which is mixed of all your life experiences to date, and will inform how you choose to not just deliver the words, but to fill the gaps that he offers, the moments of pause and the moments of reflection. And it's that sort of fusion that I think a lot of young actors and a lot of young people, or people generally coming to Shakespeare, think, oh, well, it's a very, very old text and it's revered so much, we must be very respectful, and I must perform it in a particular way, and I must use a particular voice with it. Whereas actually what I think Shakespeare wanted, and certainly what we want when we're exploring Shakespeare in productions, is to see to let the actors choose a character that resonates with them, that they see reflects some part of them, irrespective of whether that character is the right gender or age or whatever. That doesn't matter. What matters is you find something that you think, yes, I know that. I know what that feels like. And then it's a matter of how much courage you have, or how safe you feel, or how the environment that you're in is facilitated for that safety and courage, to allow you to pour as much of you and yourself and your life choices and your life experiences today into that part. And thereby it would be impossible for anyone else to be giving the same iteration of that part as you. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're talking about Shakespeare. He is, rather than another of his contemporaries or another playwright, and why he's grown to such renown, is he is so generous. He offers us so much possibility to allow us to pour as much of ourselves into the parts as possible and into the plays. So any one of us on this planet could step forward and deliver the speech that explores existentialism, that explores what happens to us after this life, with Hamlet's to be or not to be. And it will be beautiful and singular and unique, and Hamlet, and also them.
God, I love Hamlet. Sorry, go ahead.
I can't make my mind up about him.
I love him.
Why do you love him?
I don't know why. I've always loved Hamlet. I've like 6 copies of Hamlet. I've watched every production. I just love Hamlet. It just rings. All the tragedies are something that work for me, but especially Hamlet. Yeah, I just feel too much for him. Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? Because people will choose different characters over the centuries and the ages that resonate, and characters and plays go in and out of fashion, but there is something about that everyman.
Yeah.
That seems to speak to just something deep within us all, I think. And a lot of people hate Hamlet for being passive and indecisive and all of that kind of thing. But I mean, again, it's a huge generosity on the part of the author. If you imagine 400 years ago, the actor stepping forward in the Globe Theatre in front of all different levels of society at a time when people were punished for not going to church, and saying, what happens to us? What do you think happens? I mean, it would have, these are not questions that you were supposed to ask, and certainly not the unwashed masses.
Yeah.
It's, I understand. I've played the part, although I never wanted to. Right. And which wasn't one of those parts that I was drawn towards when I was a younger actor. And then I said to a friend, should I do it? And he said, the thing about playing Hamlet is not just the big speeches, because everyone gets to do those at some point in their life, but the little bits, that the interchanges that Hamlet gets. And it certainly was an immense pleasure to swim in that intellect that Shakespeare gifts this prince. To be someone that thinks those big thoughts it made me bigger in some way. I turned into a sort of 5-dimensional version of Ben for a while.
Yeah, he's intelligent and intense, and it's Yeah. I just read all of that. Yeah.
You mentioned the church, the religion thing at the time, how it was unthinkable. What he also did, and I think it's quite poignant today as well, that he brought a black character into a play with Othello, which is hundreds of years before his time. So it was a visionary there as well.
Absolutely. The number of different times, I say this in my new book, the way that Shakespeare kept reinventing himself and challenging the norms and pushing the theatrical envelope forward, as it were, it's like David Bowie, every single album completely throwing it out and reinventing himself and starting over and making a step forward. There were people of color in Elizabethan London, and there were Jewish ghettos in Europe at the time of Merchant of Venice, and Europe was in the middle of a witch craze when he wrote Macbeth. And it's incredible how he both managed to strike the tuning forks of some of the most difficult and awkward and painful things for some people. We can just say topical now, I suppose, for the time, and things that are still topical to this day. And yet he managed to do this while sneaking underneath the censor. He managed to say all these things and explore all these ideas and not be, well, sometimes he was, but not often, not be restricted. He was incredible. And I say he, but it would be remiss of me not to mention that the 20 or so other people that were working with him every day, that were a big part of the symbiotic relationship that went on in that theatre, the product of which are the handful of plays and poems that we have.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so I have a question about making Shakespeare accessible for, say, second language speakers. So you've made him accessible already through your books and all the work that you do. But how do we intrigue the second language speaker, especially the younger reader?
I think there are two surefire paths not to take, and one is the book and the page, and the other is as it were, forcing the love that we may have found for Shakespeare onto someone else. Mm-hmm. I've found that offering the one of many paths to a place that you will then be able to find your own love or hate for the works for him. I've found the sonnets really, really useful for all ages, because you don't have to worry about character, you don't have to worry about plot, you don't have to worry about reading this entire work. You have a body of 150 odd poems within, like the Tao, within which there will be something that makes you go, I know that feeling, I know what that feels like. Since I left you, my eye was in my mind. It's suddenly there's just a boom of that tuning fork again. And to be able to invite someone to meet 14 lines and say them as if they're their own words, and then to be able to start tweaking out qualities that we like to explore when we're speaking something that of heightened language that has a quality of poetry to it, of making images rich and all that kind of thing, and understanding how to really enjoy words by wringing all of the juice out of them. The sonnets are a fantastic way forward. We found that the corners of the canon, the less stereotypical choices, so perhaps rather than Romeo and Juliet or Midsummer Night's Dream, perhaps exploring Titus Andronicus or Winter's Tale, I've explored these plays, these tragic, deep, dark plays with 6 and 7 year olds. And if you ask them whether what Leontes is doing is right, or whether what Aaron is doing is right, or whatever, I mean, there's arguably no too early a stage to start hearing these opinions from our younglings. And so I think that as early as possible, finding an opportunity for them to get these words into their mouth, to light the fire in their heart, to get them to speak it as if they're their own words, to play in this world, to not worry about working through act by scene, but pushing everything to the side and saying, this is a world where fairies exist. The king and the queen of the fairies are arguing, and they love to play with mortals. And here are two sets of mortals that are in love with each other, and who's right and who's wrong, and let's just improvise and play in this world, can be terribly enriching and exciting. And perhaps these playful parts and ownership parts are the routes towards the kind of what I would call the literary criticism tools that were immediately handed when we usually approach Shakespeare in school. I would like to meet Shakespeare on the page, having had some ownership over him, having played with him a bit, and then being given tools that work so well with some of these things, with Austen and Dickens and that sort of thing, and going, you can use some of these tools and they'll help you open up these dramatic works a little bit more. But I think being given the book and giving these lit crit tools from the get-go, when most people don't have the courage to stand up and read out loud and haven't been taught how to use their own voice, the skills of oracy, let alone take on someone else's voice, the analogy that seems to stand best is this: we wouldn't introduce someone to the music of the Beatles or Mozart by giving them the score. You know, you'd give them the CD, or you'd take them to a concert, or you'd go, look, Paul McCartney played the bass, and here's a bass, and this is how it makes noise.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. Now, you spoke there about genres, which brings me beautifully on to the next question. Obviously, you know, we've got the comedies and tragedies and the historicals. Which is your favourite genre and why?
Oh.
So have I just stabbed you there? Is it like choosing your favourite kid?
That's what my father says, and probably will say to you when you meet him. I'm like you, Faiza. The tragedies have so much grit in them that stick in your heart and become part of the substance that you blossom with, I suppose. They have taught me so much, and about how theatre can resonate with you, about how the spoken word can emotionally pique you and change you and make you leave the theatre and want to call your mum, you know. I've laughed so hard with the comedies, and yet the comedies are some of the ones that we're losing because 400-year-old jokes are hard. And I think a lot of people have experience of coming away from Shakespeare thinking that maybe they spent a bit too much time laughing because everyone else was. Or indeed, a lot of my side of things, a lot of people who produce Shakespeare will make it funny around the words rather than by using the words. Which kind of leaves me with the histories. And I have to say, the new book I've written takes the Henry VI plays and shows, if one were to restrict it to them, how brilliant they are. And I hadn't really much experience of them before, I haven't played in them yet. I really love them. They're some of his earliest works, and some of the raw playwriting that's going on, and raw collaboration as well, is really exciting. I think I do an all right job in the book of convincing people that the histories can be enjoyed, but if I were to walk up to someone and say, start reading Shakespeare's plays with the histories, the dust that they would leave would be pluming. So I'll go with tragedies, because If I've got one shot, I would say seeing a really good, solid production of Lear will devastate you. It will leave you with tears in your eyes from crying and laughing. If there's a best play in terms of what makes a good play, a really strong plot, a beautiful subplot that mirrors it, brilliantly written characters from the biggest to the smallest, song, poetry, prose, a massive fight, as I said, jokes, heart-rending moments, torture. It's kind of got it all. And it's technically a tragedy. But then that's the thing, the genres are quite reductive. There's so much history in the tragedies, there's so much tragedy and comedy in the histories, there's so much of everything in the comedies. They were a nice way of ordering that first collection of Shakespeare, but there's the reason why we have the so-called problem plays, because they don't really fit in any one tragedy. And Twelfth Night, which is probably the most beautiful, or careful mix of both comedy and tragedy. And so often you'll see Twelfth Night and it'll be just comedy, or it'll just be tragedy. And for a long time, people were upset when you would go to see Macbeth and it would be funny. How dare you make a tragedy funny? But he was a dramatist. He was a brilliant one. And the Greek persona masks of comedy and tragedy don't sit separately. They sit right next to each other, touching. And I think the best works are the yin and the yang ones, the ones that have elements of both to make people laugh, which relaxes them, and then they'll be more ready to cry.
Mm. Talking again about, sort of hopping back a little bit into the tragedies, I guess. Who do you think is the most malevolent character?
The argument usually revolves around Iago and Aaron, but it's funny because both have a moment at the end of the play where they, in their own words, say, "And I'd do it again." Which is just the worst, right? Because you kind of want some regret or some sort of mercy from a character that you've learned to love in hatred to make you feel better. And the fact that Iago doesn't really give that is, after everything that he's done, is just awful. But I think that Aaron pips him at the post, because at the end of Titus, Aaron says, the character says, Lucius says, "Is there anything else you'd like, any regrets you have?" And Aaron says, "Yeah, that I don't have 1,000 more days or years or hours or whatever to do all of these terrible things again." And he's just had a speech where he says that one of the things that he's done is to go to someone who's grieving for the loss of a friend and then find the corpse that they're grieving over, wait until that grieving friend is nearly past the grief, dig up the corpse, put him on the doorstep of the person, and essentially knock on the door and run away. And it's really funny, but some of the things that Aaron does in Titus Andronicus is just so awful. And he's tied to the stake. He's just about to be killed. And he bellows out, "Yeah, I can't do it all again." And you're like, wow, you're just boned. And then it's Shakespeare, right? So he doesn't make the villain utterly villainous, because he gives Aaron a son. He gives him a baby to coddle over. Yeah. And so even though this terrible person has done all these terrible things, he's also a father. He's so good at stopping us from reducing these characters to, "Oh, he's a villain, I can hate him, it's okay that he dies." He's too clever a writer for that.
It kind of surprises me that you didn't mention Lady Macbeth or Richard III there as well.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I always I had Othello when I was in college, and I argued that Iago was justified because he was passed over for promotion by someone who, what was it? Limp-wristed almost, if you like it. But so someone who hadn't fought alongside Othello, who hadn't been through the battles, who was essentially unfit for the role, as far as Iago is concerned. I had some kind of empathy with Iago. I kind of liked him.
And I think, again, that's the genius of it, of all of these parts, that especially the more villainous characters, the more malevolent characters, as you say, that Shakespeare always writes in a crack that allows our empathy to fill, to seep in. Now, I mean, some would argue that that's a big life choice for Iago to make, having been passed over for promotion, and maybe, you know, a breath, some meditation, a little bit of mental health guidance might have been an also choice, to get over himself a little bit. But it's very human. It's a hugely human reaction to have, to be so bitter, to allow that frustration to have built up. And which of us doesn't have aspirations for more? It's so familiar, his choice. And Lady Macbeth, again, is unhappy with her lot in life. You know, the Macbeths talk about jumping the life to come. And they have the loss of a child that seems to motivate them. There's always these, you know, the other thing that Iago says to the audience, whether or not this is true, is that it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he's done my office. And he has that flicker of the male tendency towards territory that may or may not be true. Richard III, you've got to be careful what you say about Richard III, because the Richard III Society will be all over you, the people that think the king of Richard III actually was a very nice person, that Shakespeare rewrote history, or at least took history as a starting point, and wrote a great villain. He is without option for empathy right up until the end, when he's suddenly haunted and terrified and sort of goes, I sort of did this for me and for my father, and I wanted it, and now I've got it. I'm scared. And you sort of go, gosh, at the core of all of these terrible people, there beats a heart. It's really annoying.
Because you want to hate them to the very end.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have another difficult question for you. Who is like your favorite character to play the most? Who do you love to play?
There's a truism, I think, that a lot of actors love to get their teeth into a part and really get their hands dirty up to the elbows, and take a voyeuristic trip from their life into some part of themselves, or some that they daren't explore or haven't explored before. I suppose what I'm saying is a lot of actors like to sink into these villains and play the bad guy. It's fun. Mm-hmm. It's really fun. I, like I said, never had aspirations towards Hamlet, and then thoroughly enjoyed playing him. Always wanted to play Richard II, and got to a couple of years ago. And the verse in Richard II it coruscates, it's crystalline, it is almost like it's pure verse. In the drug sense of it, it's undoctored, you know. It's 99% pure. It really shimmers, and he uses this very, very high verse to explore a different side of humanity, I suppose. What it is to grow up thinking that you are the mouthpiece through which God speaks, and then over time realize that actually you're just human, and you have to let go of that divine right, and then understand what it is to be able to make eye contact with people and to be treated like a normal person. And I really enjoyed playing that, and at the same time I went over to work with a company in North America called the Seven Stages Shakespeare Company. I was going to be playing Leontes in Winter's Tale. I loved playing Leontes. In the Bohemia scenes, I got to double as Mopsa, one of the young country girls that goes off with the shepherd's son. And in the first day before we started rehearsals on Winter's Tale, I dropped into one of their staged readings and played a messenger in Richard III. And I genuinely, there's as much joy for me in the messenger parts, in the smaller parts, as there are the bigger, because there's just, I could work on a line of a messenger that Shakespeare's written for an hour or a day or a year and still be gleaning stuff from it. So if it's Shakespeare, it's pretty rich and there's lots of opportunity, and I don't really mind what I'm playing anymore. And I suppose I say that having been very fortunate to take a few swings at some leads, and it's a great thrill and joy to lead a play, and it's a really wonderful joy to be a supporting part, and it's an awesome joy to be getting to do what I started out doing, which is switching hats every 5 minutes.
Now, part of your expertise is delivering Shakespeare in its original form, the original sound of the language, if you like, the original accent. How did you learn about that, and can you possibly give us a bit of a demonstration?
I'd be glad to. So this is a recreation of the sound system that was around 400 years ago. A lot of the reason that we know what it sounds like is because the data used for it is Shakespeare's works. So this perhaps may not be the sound that you would hear if you were walking around Elizabethan London, but it's pretty close to the sound that you might hear if you happen to drop into Shakespeare's Globe 400 years ago. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds to shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lace hath all too short a day. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, perchance, or nature's changing course and trimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lives to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can say, so long lives this, and this gives life to they.
Outstanding.
Oh, you asked me how I found out about it. I found out about it from the man whose office this is, my father, who was invited to the Shakespeare's Globe in 2004. They've been exploring original practice, in other words, looking at how they used to do things 400 years ago and exploring what that might look like today. Well, they explored the original practice of architecture with the building itself. They'd explored original practice music, song, movement, fight, dance, costume. And the thing that was really left was voice. And I suppose they were worried. They hadn't done it before they invited Dad over. And in fact, when they invited him over, they were worried that it would be incomprehensible. And that it would, I think when people hear the idea of Shakespeare's accent, they probably think it will sound a little bit like their high school teacher trying to do Chaucer and be completely incomprehensible. And hopefully, as you heard just then, it sounds a little unfamiliar, but then also not hard to understand. And it's because it's early modern English that Shakespeare was writing in, an earlier version of the language that we're all speaking now. And there's something about original practices that both make people think that it will be a museum to wander around, but there's also something about original practices that is that tuning fork again, that resonates, that may not be perfect in pitch and tone, but is closest to the pitch and tone of space that he was writing for, or costume that the actors were moving in, and so thereby physically restricted in certain ways, and you know, the sound that he was hearing in his actors' voices that was inspiring him to write the next part. So there's something we found that comes with exploring this sound that seems to create a familiarity and an understanding and an ease of accessibility with people that haven't got much to do with Shakespeare, that make them go, oh, I didn't really get it before, but I get it in a way that I didn't before this.
Yeah.
So that's the lovely thing.
I completely agree with you. I saw one of your videos a number of years ago now, and it kind of it felt easier to listen to with that accent. And I'm not just fawning here at all, but it genuinely did. And I thought there was more of a rhythm there, and I think it's a mixture of a lot of different accents as well. You can hear West Country accent in there, and I've heard people say Irish and a number of things, but it's a really rounded accent, I think, as well.
If you were to trace back all of the accents of today, of English today, so many of them would find their ancestors in Elizabethan London, because those accents later were pushed out on the boats to travel the world. And we find that people often hear sounds that are close to their home and to their heart. So do you have any West Country in your family?
No. No, I'm from I went down there on a holiday once. But
there's the West Country sort of Somerset sort of sound, the Warwickshire sort of sound is one of the...
I was brought up in Warwickshire.
Well, and that's where Shakespeare was brought up, in that sort of West Countryshire part of the world. He says, generalising over a few hundred miles of space there, but still, the accents have similar similarities in that they both, with Warwickshire and Somerset, have that stronger R sound, and that's quite easy to recognise. There's some sounds that sound Irish-ish and American-ish. I could take you around the world in half a line of Shakespeare. There's a line where Richard II says, "Yet I will hammer it out," in his final speech, which in original pronunciation is "Yet I will hammer it out." Now, word by word, I say yet, I don't say yit. Shakespeare said yit, or his actors would have. And if you go to Australia, that's where you'll hear yet as yit. So Australia. The I sound is I, which if you close your mouth and round your lips a little bit more, oi, is Irish, or close to Ireland anyway. And some of the Irish sounds that came over to America as well. So Irish-ish. Australia, Irish-ish. Yit, oi. Will is just will, but it has a darker L quality to it, like the L of milk, so, and shall. Will, which is all over the world, really. Hammer is the same as hammer. It's just got that stronger rhotic R sound, like I said, from Somerset and Warwickshire and America now too. So we've gone Australia, Ireland, Europe, everywhere, America, hammer. It is just it, because 50% of the sounds of Shakespeare's time are the same as today. And then out is oot, which is Canada. So yet I will hammer it out. Australia, Ireland, America, Canada, around the world in half a line of Shakespeare. And that's wonderful in terms of familiarity and accessibility and ownership, because suddenly you're experiencing Shakespeare not in the sound of the elite and the 2% that speak received pronunciation, the Shakespeare or the sound of Shakespeare and the BBC of the 20th century. You're hearing a sound that chances are you actually own the vowels qualities of. So immediately that's one big accessibility barrier that's hurdled, which is a lovely, lovely thing.
You mentioned going all around the world there in half a line. This might be a bit of it might be tough, it might not. Who does Shakespeare best, Brits or Americans?
Who does Shakespeare best?
Yeah. I thought you were going to bite me then, Ben.
Oh no! I didn't hear. Who did Shakespeare best? Anybody that dares to allow themselves to open themselves up to it, irrespective of ethnicity, race, gender, creed, belief, background.
Okay.
When I teach original pronunciation, I say that people from the UK have 50% of the sounds in the system already, and I say the same to Americans, and I say the same wherever I go. And I think that original pronunciation is a beautiful thing to explore, and it's revealing all sorts of things about the plays. And there's only about a third of them that have been done, so there's loads of stuff still to discover about Shakespeare, which is an amazing thing to say because it's been written about to the moon and back. So that's fun. Hopefully it is something of a field leveler, that the expectation of Shakespeare will no longer be to hear it in that RP sound. And this is still happening to the very top of the tree, where really wonderful famous actors like David Tennant, who has a beautiful Scottish accent, will perform in received pronunciation. Even when received pronunciation doesn't allow some of the rhymes to work, but his Scottish accent would. And Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, both from the north of England, speaking in this beautiful received pronunciation accent. And I would love it if the idea of hearing Shakespeare is balanced by the sound, the universal sounds of original pronunciation. And that provides a bridge whereby the right sound for Shakespeare is your sound because you want to speak it, because you resonate with it, no matter where you come from. So it's a long answer to the short question. And the short answer is basically, it doesn't matter where you come from, as long as you're not trying to sound like you feel it should sound, as long as you're just trying with all of your might to speak it from the heart.
Yeah. That's a great answer. Yeah, I like that a lot. You mentioned your book earlier. What area of Shakespeare is that covering?
Shakespeare on Toast, which I wrote in 2008, was a short, accessible guide for anyone who hated Shakespeare in school or was hating Shakespeare in school. And it sort of says, don't read Shakespeare, say it out loud, experience him, go and see the theatre, and here are some of the things that will help you on that path. And I started writing this new book, Reading Shakespeare, a couple of years ago. And it starts with the posit that has proved quite apposite right now, which is, imagine that you were stuck on a desert island with all the things that you need for your comfort, but you can't go anywhere, and the only thing you can do is read Shakespeare. Because, of course, having been such an advocate of the theatre and his works living on the stage, I recognize that suddenly saying reading Shakespeare is great would be quite an about face. That said, I take great joy from reading Shakespeare now, just like I'm sure a bunch of musicians take a lot of joy from looking at scores of music because they've got the skill sets to be able to appreciate them. So I think we can enjoy reading Shakespeare, but there are ways to help that without just going, here you go. So the book is called Reading Shakespeare. Close Encounters of the Bardic Kind, I think is the subtitle at the moment. And it sort of says, well, so if you want to read the works, where do you start? Because do you read it by genre? Do you read it alphabetically? Do you read it chronologically? And would that be interesting to follow Shakespeare's path over the 20 years? And if you're going to do that, how do you do it?
What's your writing process, Ben?
Well, I spent a good chunk of the book looking at what Shakespeare's writing process might have been and seems to have been from what we can glean from the works. I hope it was nothing like mine. And my father's writing process, I think every writer has their own process. I hear, Philip Pullman used to, I don't know if he still does, get up early, bang out his few thousand words of a day and join his family for breakfast. I have never been that writer. My father was commissioned for his first book in London, left the meeting, went to Paddington Station. His train was late. He finished the book by the time he got home and had it in publishers on the Monday morning. I am not that writer either. I will spend a lot of time looking. Well, when I was a younger writer, I would spend a lot of time looking at that blinking cursor on the blank screen, and I've learned lots of really useful methods and processes to avoid doing that, because that way no progress will be made and madness lies. I made a short film 10 odd years ago called Notes. It's a silent film, only 10 minutes long, about a writer trying to write the great novel and procrastinating with post-it notes until his entire life is governed by post-it notes. I've lived that life a little bit as a writer. I generally find that I will find an idea, push out 5,000 words, and then it becomes pizza dough. I'll stretch it out and expand on it, expand on it, and expand on it until it's like a massive lasagna pie. And then I'll start whittling down and sculpting it, and it turns into a statue that I'm shaping and polishing. I find it very difficult. I always feel when I finish a book that I'll never write again, and I enjoy it immensely. I think one of my favorite quotes about writing is Oscar Wilde's. I spent all day working on a poem. In the morning, I added a comma. In the afternoon, I took it out again. I adore, and I hope that I've managed to achieve this sometimes, thinking about the reader's experience, the flow, the pace, and trying to gift them the idea that we're having a conversation of some kind, that they can hear me through the prose. So it's awful and miserable, and I love it.
Okay, I have one last question. You go on.
I've got another one.
Yeah.
Go on.
Okay, go on.
Me first.
No, you're first.
All right, okay.
It's a paper, scissors.
What about directing, Ben? How hard is it to direct an actor in a Shakespeare play?
They say that there's another sort of cliche truism that some of the best directors have acted, and I couldn't tell you if I'm any good at either, but I certainly enjoy working with actors, having been on the receiving end of being asked to do some things that I don't agree with or don't understand. And when I say don't agree with, I don't mean in any damaging way. Just I didn't think I would take the character in that direction, sort of thing. Although, there are those factors too, and thank goodness that there's a growing movement for intimacy coordinators and directors to facilitate a safer rehearsal room for practitioners. The ensembles that I've been blessed to curate works off of modern adaptations of original practices. So we look at how they used to rehearse and perform and see if we can find modern versions of it. And so we use cue scripts, and we have very minimal rehearsal time, and we explore how to play with each other. And we don't have a director, much like Shakespeare's time. There wasn't the concept of director didn't come about until the last couple hundred years or so, mid 1800s, I believe. And so I've been exploring guidance and facilitation. We talk about shepherding or outside eyes a lot. And but we spent a lot of time coming up with the vision together. And in the first ensemble that I curated, it was called an ensemble, but it was very much a director-led ensemble. I was feeling the pressure from myself, as well as the outside world, to lead and to have the vision. And in the last few years, I've been exploring more and more just how scary it feels sometimes, but just to get out of the way. That the skill, as Nick Heitner, the director of the National Theatre, once said, is 80% in the casting and 20% in solving the mistakes you made in casting. But essentially, get the right group of people together and allow the wisdom of the crowd to be the way forward. Yeah. Although that does need some wafting, some structure to allow the wisdom of that crowd to really excel. And I think that's the balance that needs to be struck in collaboration, and I think must have been at the heart of, no, that's not true. I wanted to have been at the heart of their work 400 years ago. The realities were that there were a core group of sharers that ran the building and a very strong line between the masters and the apprentices. And yet still, there seems the work is so rich and seems to be such a symbiotic process that collaboration, certainly on the writing side of things, seems to be such the norm that we've been leaning into that. And it provides, again, ownership, play, great life and energy. This process of raising a show, not rehearsing it to death, not filtering every choice through one person, and it seems to make the plays live in a different way. I'm not saying better, but definitely different, and that's what we're excited at. So I enjoy finding out how to do this every day, and failing again. As Beckett says, hopefully failing better.
Okay, if not Shakespeare, then who for Ben Crystal? So
good question.
Oh, these are staggering questions, and I thank you for them. You're really making me think. I've spent a little bit of time dabbling around the contemporaries of the time, and they've never particularly resonated, whether it's Lilly or Middleton or Johnson or Marlowe. So as much as I'm fascinated by the time, it's the playwright that really sings to me. So it's not the time period that I want to stay in if I don't get Shakespeare. I have great aspirations to form an ensemble that feels that they are expert at Shakespeare and sort of tick that box, and then see what it would be to turn that ensemble's attention to Chekhov and to Ibsen, to Beckett, to Pinter, to Miller. I'm listing a lot of male authors here, but those authors from the 18th, 19th and 20th century that seem to have a similar dedication to craft and similar amounts of mystery about them, that seem to be actors, playwrights in terms of the opportunities that they afford. And indeed, you know, Sarah Kane, Simon Stevens of the more recent times. So somewhere in the Beckett Ibsen world, I think. Yeah, somewhere around there. I'll go with that. They seem like nice people to spend. That's not true. Their works seem like interesting works to spend time with. I'm not sure I want to spend time with the people. I don't think I'd want to spend time with Shakespeare, though. Goodness knows. He might have been awful.
That really does surprise me.
Yeah.
Okay, very, very quick one. What did you think of Lehrmann's Romeo and Juliet?
Changed my life. Changed my life. I remember standing at the back of the Boland Lecture Theatre in Lancaster University, where Film Society was, a couple of nights a week. And I fell in love with DiCaprio and Danes, just like everybody else. I marveled at the hedonism that the actor who played Mercutio, whose name has just slipped my mind, gave that beautiful part. The setting, that sort of dry, dusty theatre outside. John Leguizamo as Tybalt, Brian Dennehy as Capulet, who had a moment in a car, but with such authority. The whole kit and caboodle, the party scene, the balcony, the swimming pool. Yeah. It was the adaptation as well, which was brave, and a lot of purists we will say terrible things about the cut. I just loved every single second of it, and it turned an entire generation onto Shakespeare in the 90s in the way that Branagh did in the 80s, and I suppose in the way that Olivier did in the 50s and Gielgud did in the 30s. You know, it was looking at the way that I now approach Shakespeare when I produce. I've realized that and you asking me this, that it taught me something about ownership, about not feeling subservient to these pieces, about recognizing that they are infinitely stronger than I am, and that I can rip them up and tear them apart and make them my own, or the companies or the people that I'm working with anywhere on the globe, to tell the story that we want to tell. And they'll still be there in their entire state for someone else to do that. And that you can focus them down and have them resonate with one particular type of life, or you can broaden them out onto a blank stage like Shakespeare's lot did and have them resonate with everything. You can cut them to shreds, or you can do them in their entirety. It's like we started with, you know, it's just they're inviting you to bring as much of yourselves to them as possible, to say, you know, put your thumbprint down and then pass it on to the next person. So yeah, love it or hate it. It transformed so many people's lives, and probably was a big inspiration in me wanting to not change other people's lives, but provide as many different opportunities and bridges to this place to go. If you come to it, it might do the same for you, if you let it.
The thing with his plays as well, I saw Macbeth as in a Reservoir Dogs style at the Octagon in.
Oh yeah.
And of course, you know, Mackellar's Richard III it's sort of World War II, and so you can put them in almost any context, and they still work. I went once to when I lived in Manchester. I went to see Richard III by the Budapest Shakespeare Company, and I sat down, and they started off, and it was all in Hungarian.
First time I saw Pericles on the stage, Pericles was the first play I read without having seen it before, and I understood pretty much every word. I was just at the turning point in reading, and then a year or two later I saw Ninagawa, the Japanese director, auteur really, bring his company to the National, and they did Pericles, and they had side titles. It broke my heart into tiny little pieces. I barely understood a single word unless I read it. I could follow the story. And everyone else in the theatre was the same. And there's a moment when Pericles, spoilers, is reunited with his daughter Marina, and in the text he sort of says, "Are you real? Are you of substance? Are you a fairy?" And at that point in the text, in the play, the Japanese actor reached out and tried to pinch his daughter, and gasped with a sob as he made contact, and saw that she was real and he wasn't just hallucinating or in grief. And every single person that I could feel in the audience, I saw a production in Slovakia of Merry Wives of Windsor, which is not a good play, in Slovakian, with no subtitles or side titles or third titles. And it was absolutely brilliant. They did it as this madcap pantomime. It was preposterous. We just, the Shakespeare Ensemble and I took 3 shows to Japan last autumn, and we played to some really small communities that never had Shakespeare before, very rarely English theatre. 99% of the audience couldn't speak English. And if they could, it was barely, I suppose, for the most part. And someone came up to us afterwards and said, "Didn't understand a word you said. Followed every second of the story. Communication of heart is your craft." And that's the thing, you know, like, it's not just Shakespeare though. You can go and see an Italian opera and not understand Italian and be terribly, terribly moved. And I think if the creators of the performance are transmitting, embodying the engine, the essence of the characters' emotional reality from the tips of their fingers to the core of themselves, it's really hard not to be moved, no matter the language. And so for anyone out there watching this that feels that in order to get to Shakespeare, they need first to get the English language, I'm absolutely here to say that's not the case. And also, there are so many beautiful translations of Shakespeare in so many different languages. And the sonnets, coming back to the sonnets especially, have some really great translations out there. And if the worst comes to worst, I suppose we could use Google Translate. But maybe not maybe not No Fear Shakespeare.
Any chance of bringing your work to the Middle East, to Dubai?
Thrilled.
COVID? Yeah.
I'd be thrilled.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Absolutely. We were very honored a couple of years ago. The company that I used to work with, we were invited to the Sharjah Children's Literature Festival, and gave Shakespeare a birthday show. The work that we do more normally away from the children's education side of things is that we're taking around the world is really visceral and challenging and I hope emotionally resonating and often wherever we go, especially when we're commissioned, we will prepare ourselves and we're one of my great fellows says we are over prepared and under planned. So we'll arrive together in that state, and then we will make the show in a couple of days' time in response to our community, in response to the community that we're in. Oh. So to bring some of Shakespeare's more challenging works, could we say, or deeper, darker works to the Middle East, and see how we can work with the community. We always try and work with actors that are local to the area, not just, as it were, parachute in and leave. We're very much about leaving legacies behind us and skills and tools. We always run workshops and as I say, try and work with actors in the productions as well. So it would be a real joy to come to the Middle East and do that kind of work. So I hope so, inshallah.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, fingers crossed. And yeah, we can do more than a virtual handshake.
Yeah.
That would be a joy. That would be a great joy.
Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and learning.
Me too. Thank you.
About your hero and our hero as well, really. Yeah.
I feel it. Your love for these works is coming through the void of the internet. I feel it very strongly. It's wonderful.
That's excellent. Once again, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for providing such a beautiful, generous platform that's much needed at the moment. It's really nourishing work that you're doing. So
we're just enjoying ourselves, you know.
I can see it.
And we're learning so much as well.
Yeah.
All the best.
Cheers.